Hey, welcome! I'm Pastor John Boyacek, and this is Fairview Baptist Church. We're so glad that you could join us for a slice of what Fairview life is all about. We want you to be here and be part of what God is doing in this community.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here today. Am I mic'd? Are you hearing me all right? All right, good. My name is Tim Strickland, and I work with Feb Central Fellowship of Evangelical Baptists across Ontario and English part of Quebec. And I was invited by Pastor John to be with you here today. And what I do is I do all kinds of things working with churches and pastors all around our province and again into Quebec, helping them with whatever they need, visiting churches, encouraging pastors' boards, whatever I can do to support them in doing the work that they do. And that includes your church and Pastor John right here. John and I have become friends through my involvement with the fellowship. And I know, of course, his brother Joe, about a little over a year ago, Joe and I did a seminar together at the Feb Central Conference. And I've been following that, what's been going on with him and Heather and his family closely with great concern, as I'm sure you all share, and you're all praying for him. Before I joined Feb Central, I just started in this role about 3 months ago. I was a pastor in Toronto in the beaches. And I know what you're thinking, well, somebody has to go to the beach and there I am. Somebody has to go to the beach and minister there. So that's where I was pastoring down, if you know where they shoot up fireworks by Ashridge's Bay in Toronto. Not quite downtown, but pretty much downtown area. And I want to tell you a couple of connections I feel to Lindsay. The first one is that I used to come here as a boy because my grandparents lived in Pefferlaw, if you know where that is, a little ways, I guess, west of here. And I would go up there in the summer and stay for a week, and we'd often come to Lindsay because some of my family would be my grandmother's, I guess, sister and brother-in-law. Their names were Mert and Dorothy Leach. Maybe some of you knew them in the past. But they had a farm in the Lindsay area, and so we'd come here, and I always enjoyed those times. But also, in more recent times, I would often compare the beach to Lindsay in Toronto. Now, some of you are looking at me saying, why would you do that? They're not very similar, Tim. And you're right, but I'll tell you why I did. I noticed when I looked at census numbers that the population of Lindsay, whenever they took the census, and the population of the neighborhood, the beach, where I was pastoring, were approximately the same. About 21,000 people, give or take. Now, maybe the numbers are different now, but that's about what it was when I looked. And I would tell people this because in our neighborhood, which was a lot denser, of course, than Lindsay, because it's urban Toronto, we were arguably at the time the largest evangelical church in a neighborhood of 21,000, and we were not really that close to breaking 100. And I wanted people to explain that would be like a place like Lindsay, and that's how I compared the beach to Lindsay, only having one evangelical church with 50 or 60 people attending, and trying to explain how great the need is in urban Toronto for the gospel of Jesus. That's where I was pastoring, but by God's grace, we did see things move forward there, and now I'm working with Feb Central, helping other churches, especially in revitalization. But I want to talk today about the book of Daniel and about living faithfully in Babylon. That's the title of the message, and I'll explain why that title is as we go forward. Now, if you went to Sunday school, I bet a couple of you went to Sunday school growing up. You probably heard about Daniel. And when you think of Daniel, what do you remember? What do you think of? Shout it out. Tell me. The lion's den. There you go. That's one of the best stories in the Bible, isn't it? That's a good one for Sunday school, and we love that. We think of that. We think of, what's another story we think of in the book of Daniel? Ooh. Oh, that took a second, but you got it. The fiery furnace, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three friends of Daniel. Today we're going to look at Daniel chapter 1. And I want to talk a bit about Babylon, first of all. I've got the clicker here. Let's see if the clicker is working today. All right, what happened in Daniel, and I want you to just get the context of what we're going to talk about, is that Daniel and his three friends and other young Jewish men, probably, maybe 15 years old at the time, not old at all, they were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon in approximately 605 BC. And the Babylonian Empire lasted from 606 to 536 BC. But in 605, I believe the year is, that's when Daniel was moved from Jerusalem to Babylon, taken captive, taken away from his country, from his family, hundreds of miles to live in Babylon. And they were taken there to be part of a royal youth training program. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Here's a picture, if we go forward to the next slide. Let's see if I can get there. This is an artist's conception of ancient Babylon. And it's actually cool if you can look closer. I realize you can only get a glance looking at it here today. But if you look this up online like I did, you can see it's just an amazing city. It was a great and powerful city because the Babylonian Empire was the big reigning world empire of its day. You can see the river running right through it, the moat around it, multiple walls built for defense. In the middle of it, some sort of temple to the god Marduk, who was their kind of the top of their pantheon of gods. And the royal palace, I would assume, in the middle there, and all that kind of stuff. So it was, by the standards of its day, an incredible city. They had the Hanging Gardens in Babylon, considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. That's where Daniel was taken to be trained and equipped in the ways of Babylon. If we look at what archaeology does for us today, they have it. There's this brick with Nebuchadnezzar's name on it. He was kind of proud. If you read the book of Daniel, you'll see quickly the King Nebuchadnezzar, this great king who really led this empire forward. He was kind of a proud guy, and he would carve his name on the bricks that were being used to build the walls. And this particular one, it's in the British Museum, and it's funny, one of the workmen also wrote his name on it, and I suspect they didn't tell Nebuchadnezzar because I don't think he would have been impressed. There's another one here. This is a cuneiform cylinder. This is something they would do. They would bury this at the base of something that they were building in hopes that future people would find it and see how impressive they were. And so that's what happened. We dug it up, centuries later, and we find this thing talking about Nebuchadnezzar. And I actually have the quote here, I think, of what it says on it. He says, he likes the word I. It's one of his favorite words. I built a strong wall that cannot be shaken with bitumen and baked bricks. I laid its foundation on the breast of the netherworld. I built its top as high as a mountain. He's very impressive, and he knows it. Do you see that? And so Nebuchadnezzar was this incredible builder, incredible place where Daniel went. Now in the Bible, you'll find that there's two archetypal cities, I'll call them. By that I mean two cities that are representative of other cities to come. And there's two primary ones. The first is Jerusalem, which is the city of God, the place where God is worshipped. The point of Jerusalem is that God's name is to be made great and worshipped in Jerusalem. The other city, the other archetypal city, is Babylon, or in its origin it was called Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Now, you remember in Genesis 11 the story of the Tower of Babel, how they wanted to build this great tower to the sky because they wanted to make a name for themselves. And that's the fundamental difference between the city of God and the city of man. In the city of God, the purpose is to make God's names great, to worship Him. But in Babel, or Babylon, the city of man, the purpose is to make man's name great, to make humanity's name great rather than the name of God great. Do you see the fundamental difference and how that might create tension and conflict between these cities? Now, I do want to say that, Babel, that's ancient. We are much more civilized here in Canada, our capital of the province in Toronto. We would never think of, trying to build great towers to the sky to make our name great. That's not something we as modern, sophisticated people would be so... You're laughing like maybe you think we would. Maybe. Oh yeah, we've done that. That's right. We actually still do that. When I drive down the Gardiner in Toronto, I count cranes as and try not to crash and count. And one time a few years ago, I think I got lost count around 40, counting the cranes that are putting towers up across our city. We still do the same thing today, because Jerusalem again and Babylon are these two archetypal cities, pointing to either God's way or man's way. And I think we recognize in our nation today that while it once was a strong Christian nation, we've drifted from that. And the reason the book of Daniel is so significant for us is because Daniel was experiencing something like what we experience. He was born in a Christian land, but now he's living in Babylon. If we go to the next slide, our nation, like I say, has good Christian roots. This is a nice picture of the Fathers of Confederation. Isn't that nice? You get a sense of the difference between us as Canadians versus our American friends to the south, because when they found a nation, it's the rockets, red flare, the bombs in the air, and when we found a nation, we sit around having tea and in a nice room and sign some paperwork, and this is 1867. They've just had a civil war, and we're drinking tea and having a good time. And but if you look in this picture, you'll see there's a guy there. See the guy with the book open there? You see him. He's off to the left, middle left over there, and that's the Bible. That's Leonard Tilley, and what he's doing, you can see he's got the Bible open, and he's looking at a key verse in our nation, which is when they were founding Canada, they wanted to find a verse that could or something that could be our motto. And Leonard Tilley found a verse in the Psalms, and it says, "His dominion shall be from sea to sea." And that became the motto of Canada. And that's just a picture illustrating the founding of Canada and signing the documents. And part of it is that the Bible is there open amidst those guys sitting around founding Canada. And if you look in our history, you see there's much to do with our Christian heritage. That verse ended up getting carved on the Peace Tower when it was built. You can go to Ottawa, you can see that verse carved on the Peace Tower. You can see other verses carved on there. "Give the king thy judgments, O Lord," from Psalm 72:1. "Where there is no vision, the people perish," from Proverbs 29:18. That's on the Peace Tower in Ottawa. You can go see that. When we award the Order of Canada, we say, what is the motto of that? They desire a better country. The people who get this high civilian award on it is right out of the book of Hebrews. They desire a better country. So there's so much in our country that has that Christian heritage, but we know that's changed. Somewhere between the sexual revolution of the 60s to the falling of the Berlin Wall, really the Western world changed, and Canada was part of that change. We went from being Christian countries to moving more and more towards being secular countries, post-Christian, some would say. And that was a significant change that many of you here in the room have lived through and watched happen. And that psalm that Brian read earlier, "By the Rivers of Babylon," I put it on the front of your notes. There's notes in your bulletin if you didn't open that yet, and we're going to track with this during the sermon. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon," and I've got it in the King James here, just because there's a song that's written that actually matches these words. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion." And then at the bottom it says, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" The 70s, I don't know what they were, disco, pop, Caribbean, steel drum band, Boney M. Who knows who Boney M is? This looks like a Boney M kind of crowd. Okay. And they sang a song, "By the Rivers of Babylon." Maybe a few of you know that song, and it's based on this psalm. And it's a lament, is what it is. It's a lament saying, there we are, the people of Israel, sitting by the rivers of Babylon, weeping when we think back to Jerusalem, the city of God. They're weeping. And it says they were told, well, you got to sing, you got to sing a song and be happy. And they said, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land, in a foreign land? How can we do that? And sometimes in Canada, I think as Christians, we can feel that way. We feel like we're in a strange land. Something's changed. We've lost something, and we feel like we're not going to get it back. That's why the book of Daniel's for us today. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 1, because Daniel was written to answer this kind of question. How do God's people live faithfully in Babylon? Because that's what Daniel had to do. And we're going to look at Daniel chapter 1. It's not quite as famous a story as the Lion's Den, but it's still a pretty good story. And if you've got your Bible, I invite you to turn to Daniel chapter 1, and I'm going to start reading the first couple of verses. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, that refers to Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And just before we continue, I just want to pause and pray God's blessing on us as we continue in His Word. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you are God, that your name is great. And may we always be a people who seek to follow the example of Jerusalem as it was intended, to make your name great. And I pray right now you would bless us as we look into your word and look at the book of Daniel, and particularly the story in the chapter 1 of Daniel, that you would speak to our hearts and challenge us in whatever way we need today. You know each one. You know what they need. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So Daniel, along with his friends, they're taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem has been conquered. And I want you to notice in verse 2 it says, "The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." That is the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So it wasn't just that things went bad or God wasn't paying attention to what was happening in Israel. What actually happened is God said, "Israel, for hundreds of years you've been rebelling against me, turning away from me, ignoring my laws, not following after me. And I said that if you did that, I would give you over into captivity one day, and now the time has come." So it wasn't just that God was passive in this. God actively allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come and conquer Jerusalem and take people captive. Does that worry you a bit? That God would do that? I think we need to remember that we worship a God who is slow to anger. And he was patient with them for hundreds of years. But finally the time came where judgment came. God did this, and allowing, in this sense, for his name to seem not so great, because his people now are in captivity, and that doesn't look good on him. But he realized that was needed at the time, for Israel to experience this time of judgment and punishment, so they could be restored, a remnant once again. If you continue reading in the Bible, you see that. But God did this. And there they are. And it says that Nebuchadnezzar took the vessels, that is the utensils and cups and so on, gold, silver, whatever they were made of, that they used in the temple in Jerusalem, and took them to Babylon and put them in the temple of his God. Do you see the symbolism? He's saying, your God stinks, my God is great. And while your God might kind of be okay, we won't destroy everything completely of his vessels, but we're going to put them, and he's going to work for my God now. You see what the symbolism is? And so it's very significant. The temple in Jerusalem eventually will be destroyed in 587 BC. But for now, the vessels are taken out of it and put in the temple of Marduk, the false god, in Babylon. Verse 3, it says, "Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans," that is, the Babylonians. The king assigned them daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. That's up to verse 7. So let's just notice 3 things in this part of the passage. The first thing is that Daniel and his 3 friends are put under the charge of the chief of the eunuchs. Now, all the men are quite worried right away when they hear about this. This does not sound good. And this could have simply been a leader. It doesn't necessarily mean what the word eunuch means, but it may well mean what the word eunuch means. The first thing I want to point out that happened to Daniel and his 3 friends, it appears they were seriously physically wrecked in a culture where having children was so important. And this was a serious thing that happened to them. Because if you're under the chief of the eunuchs, probably you're among them. There's a second thing that I want you to note, and that is that they were to be trained in the ways of Babylon. What King Nebuchadnezzar was doing, it was quite smart. He was taking people from foreign lands who he had taken over, bringing their best and brightest young people to be trained up to be Babylonians, and then they would be seen as kind of leading people, and it would basically help him to govern. because he could say to the Jewish people, well, we've got Daniel and all these other nice guys who are Jewish people, and look how nice we are. We train them up, we let them be leaders, we let them do good things, and it was a way to control the empire. You understand the politics of it? And Daniel is part of this thing, and they're going to be trained in all the literature, the culture, the blatant paganism and false religious system of the Babylonians. The third thing I want you to catch is that their names were changed. And I want to just stop here and look at this for a minute. It's in your notes at the bottom of the second page. Daniel, his name, and what's important about this is that when we give people names, we often do it because we like the sound of it, or because our parent or grandparent or somebody is named after them. I have a middle name. One of my middle names is Francis. And last night I went to visit my grandfather in the hospital in St. Catharines. He's 98 years old, and he had to go into the hospital. He's actually in pretty good health, considering. And normally he's called Frank, but I guess his legal name is Francis. So they said, oh, you're coming to see Francis. And that's my middle name, Francis. I got named because of my grandfather, and some of you might have that as well. But in ancient times, understand, names were often more than that. There was a sense of identity. They would name people based on a hope for what that person would be, or based on some event that was significant that was happening in the country at the time. So the name wasn't simply, like I suspect this year there'll be a lot of babies named Harry or Meghan, for obvious reasons. But at that time it was deeper than that. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Whenever you see El in a Hebrew name, that's the name of God in their name. Daniel, God is my judge. He was renamed Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect his life. And Bel is another name for Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians. Hananiah, one of these other young men, his name means the Lord is gracious. He was called Shadrach, which means the command of Aku, the moon god of Babylon. Mishael, who is what God is. It's kind of like something we sang this morning, praising God how great and amazing he is. Who is what God is what his name means. Meshach is what he gets called. Who is what Aku is. Another tribute to the moon god. Azariah, whose name means the Lord has helped, becomes Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, the god of wisdom. I want you to catch really clearly what is happening to Daniel and his three friends. The intent is to completely assimilate them, wash away their Judaism and their Jewish background, and make them into nice young Babylonians. They're young men at an impressionable age, probably around 15 years of age. And it's just a great time to assimilate them and completely change them so they'll forget all that stuff from Jerusalem and now be good leaders in Babylon. Do you see why this book is relevant to us today? Because is that not what our culture tries to do to us? Again, Canada has this Christian heritage. It's not all bad what goes on today. Sometimes we just focus on the bad. I think we need to remember that we still are living on some of the fumes of our Christian heritage. Some of the good things are we're a generous, charitable spirit as Canadians. We have that. We desire fair treatment of people. We're generally kind to newcomers. We try to care for God's earth. And we desire, I think genuinely as Canadians, to be good citizens both at home and abroad. And all of that reflects a Christian heritage. But then there's many values that have been rejected in our country. Biblical authority has been replaced by secular authorities. God's design for sexuality has been replaced with a very different value system that is prominent now. The uniqueness of Jesus has been replaced by any religion or combination of religious beliefs or a lack thereof. The sanctity of life has been replaced by human preference, both at the earliest and latest stages of life. And faith is considered a private matter that should not influence public decisions. So we need to still remember there's some good, but we still need to be aware there's a lot of stuff that isn't good. It's turned away from the Lord. Just like Daniel and his friends were experiencing pressure to conform, to compromise, to assimilate, so too we face that pressure today in Canada, don't we? What do we do? How do we live faithfully as God's people? Well, let's continue in the text. In verse 8, it says this, but Daniel. Just say that with me. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Let's just pause there. You don't catch it in English, but in the Hebrew it's really plain. The word set is being used in this passage. That the chief of the eunuchs is setting these things, he's setting their names, and that's the Hebrew word being used. The word that we translate resolved is the same word. It's saying all these things are being set upon Daniel, but very intentionally the author of Daniel writes, but Daniel said. Do you see it? It's a contrast. He's pushing back, saying a line's got to be drawn somewhere. But Daniel said. In the old King James it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart. And there's something in here for us. One of the first things we need to do when we're living in Babylon, and we are, is to purpose in our hearts that we are going to follow after God when the difficult situations arise. Let me ask you, have you set in your heart and said, to the best of my ability, trusting in the Lord to help me, I'm going to follow after God, even when the culture pushes a different way? This is the start of how Daniel succeeded in his life and ministry and work in Babylon. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now, the issue he was facing is different than what we face today. Likely the issue was that the food he was being asked to eat and drink would have violated the Jewish ceremonial laws, which we're not under anymore. It doesn't apply to us. But it certainly applied to him, and he said, and it's interesting, there were a lot of things he could have drawn the line on. I mean, he was being trained to be a good pagan, and there were a whole bunch of things he could have said no to, but he picked his battles, and for whatever reason, he chose this one and said, that's where I'm going to make my stand. And so it says God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigns your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are in your age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Just follow the story here. Daniel goes to the chief of the eunuchs who's over him and says, I can't eat this food. We got to figure something out here. And the chief of the eunuchs is very sympathetic to him. Obviously, Daniel was a winsome person. And you notice in the passage, he goes to the chief of the eunuchs graciously. He's not there to cause a fight. He's not there to cause big problems and make a stink. He doesn't bring, signs waving, we will not eat the food. He goes to him graciously, and he has a relationship with him. And the chief of the eunuchs is very sympathetic to him and says, listen, I understand, but if you guys are not healthy, they'll chop my head off at the end of the time you're supposed to be ready. So I'd like to help you, but I simply can't because I don't want to die. Verse 11, then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Just before I tell you what he said, do you see what Daniel does? The chief of the eunuchs is sympathetic to him, so he goes and finds, he goes through the bureaucracy is what he does. He says, well, the chief of the eunuchs would like to help me but can't. Why don't I talk to the guy who's in charge of the food, chief steward, and see if he can help me? And the steward, no doubt knowing that the chief of the eunuchs was sympathetic but felt his hands tied, is willing to do something. So listen to what happens in verse 12. Daniel says to him, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. When I was pastoring in Toronto, there was a man attending the church who was a brain surgeon at Western Hospital. And it kind of ruined, if ever you wanted to say, well, you'd have to be a brain surgeon to figure this out. I couldn't say that because I had to stick with rocket scientists because we didn't have any of those. But brilliant man, very kind man named Vitor. And he said to me, Tim, this may be the first scientific control group study ever recorded. And I thought, well, I never thought of it that way. Very, very smart man. And he said, and a control group study, those of you who have done some studies or you may know about these, you take two groups and you change one variable in one group and keep everything the same in the other group. And then you do whatever the test is with the variable changed, and after a period of time you compare what it was like at the beginning and what it was like at the end and see if that variable has made any difference or not. You all track with me? Just basic scientific method is what Daniel proposed that they use. At the end of the 10 days, verse 15, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables, which is a word referring not just to fruit and apples and stuff, or not apples, but fruit and stuff. It refers to food from the ground, is what it refers to. I want you to catch what Daniel did to live faithfully in Babylon, because I think there's an important lesson in here for us. And it's in your notes on the third page, about the middle of the page. Again, Daniel was not looking for a fight. He was looking for what I would call a win-win. You've heard about people looking for a win-win? Daniel certainly was doing that. He found a way to achieve the king's goal of good health for his civil servants without compromising his beliefs. What Daniel saw is that, yes, the king was asking him to eat food that he didn't want to eat because it would violate his beliefs. Josh, can we move up to that slide? It's a few slides ahead. Just throw it up there. I forgot to move it ahead. He saw that the king actually isn't trying to make me eat food and violate my beliefs. The king just wants us to be healthy. And in trying to make us want to be healthy, his rules are causing trouble for me, and that I'll have to break God's law. So what Daniel said is, I think there's a win-win here. I think we can find a way that I can be even more healthy and not disobey God's laws. And that's what he proposed when he went and spoke to the chief of the eunuchs and then to the steward who was under the chief of the eunuchs. Do you see the wisdom in that? And I think in our culture, what we need to be doing is looking for ways when we're challenged in our beliefs, maybe it's in our workplace, maybe it's in our family, maybe it's just with our neighbors, whatever it might be, where we see a win-win. And one of the things we can do is we can appeal to values that are Christian values that some Canadians still hold. We can look for ways to find, well, how does what they're trying to do appeal to the generous, charitable spirit of Canadians? How does what they're trying to accomplish seek to desire fair treatment for all people? How does it seek to be kind to newcomers? Or how does it seek to care for the earth? Or how does what they're trying to do it comes out of a desire to genuinely be good? Because many Canadians, despite a lack of Christian beliefs, still have some of those Christian beliefs in their lives. And you may find, if you think that way, instead of just saying, I'm going to fight, I'm going to find a way that there'll be a win-win. You may find there's ways to not agree with what somebody is doing, but still approve their value as a human being. You might find a way that you might not be able to do that exact team event at work, but you might still be able to do some kind of team event at work that doesn't violate your beliefs. There's opportunities for win-wins all over the place if we pray, seek the Lord, and think about it, and not just default to being stubborn and fighting. Do you tracking with me? A second thing I want you to see is Daniel showed respect and found favor with people in authority to achieve their common goals. Earlier this year, when I was still pastoring at Waverley, I had to call our MP. At least I felt I had to call him, because there was an issue going on. I won't get into the details of what it was, but it was an issue where I felt the government was doing something that was inappropriate, and it affected us directly as a church. And I made a point of calling him, but I tried to be as gracious and kind with him as I could, realizing that, at least assuming his desire is to do the best for our constituents. He has a fairly good reputation in our community. And yet I had to go with something I disagreed with. And now I can't tell you that we resolved it was all restored, but I felt at least I opened up an opportunity to continue to connect with him. And then when I saw him again, I was able to have a good connection with him then there. And again, I could have gone in with guns blazing because I felt the issue was wrong and I felt it deserved to be addressed and that it was, in my mind, nonsense what was going on. But I felt, no, it's more important to build a relationship with this man because many of the things he's doing are legitimately good, even if I don't always agree with his politics. Maybe you'll have opportunities, whether it's with a local MP, a local politician, so maybe it's your boss at work, maybe it's somebody in your family who has authority in your family. Look for ways to be gracious, to build those relationships, so that when you need to change something or propose something different, a win-win, you're doing it not as somebody who always causes trouble, but somebody who is gracious and kind and is good to work with. Do you see how Daniel did that? And then finally, I want you to notice that you need to be always looking and praying for ways to work with these people to achieve these common goals, but without compromising your beliefs. Now, I realize sometimes it isn't possible. Because, Daniel has the story of the lion's den and the fiery furnace, and all the good talking in the world wasn't going to get him through that without a miracle from God. But Daniel 1 shows us there are many times where we can find a win-win by being wise, by seeking the Lord's help, and then looking for ways we can use relationships to accomplish common goals that we still don't compromise our beliefs. I encourage you today, when you're out for lunch or home at lunch or whatever you're doing, talk over this message, think about this message, and pray through it in your heart. How does this apply to me? What have I experienced in the past few months where I've been challenged on my beliefs? What is going on in my life right now? Pray, say, Lord, what is a win-win for me? What's a win-win for my family and whoever else is in this situation? Is there a way I can stand firm while finding a win-win? Talk about that together. Pray about that together. You might be amazed what opportunities God might open up as you talk about these things together and pray together as family and friends, and see that God can do the same kind of things for you He did for Daniel so many years ago. Well, let's read the rest of the passage and see how it ends. It says, as for these 4 youths, that's Daniel and his 3 friends, this is verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. See what happens to Daniel? God honors what he does. And him and his 3 friends become like the top of the class. And the king recognizes this. And they just excel above everyone else. And Daniel served for decades. By the time of the story of the lion's den, it was decades and decades later. Daniel might have been close to 80 years old or something, around 80. Because he served faithfully in Babylon, not compromising his beliefs, following after God. Because he practiced, I'm sure, these kind of principles for a lifetime. And God blessed that. Now the last line in the passage, we don't even hardly pay attention to it. It says, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So we think, well, wasn't that nice? He was there until the time of King Cyrus. Sounds wonderful. But if you're reading this as a Jewish person, years later after the stories happened, I want you to catch what this means. You see, Daniel came to Babylon in 605 BC under Nebuchadnezzar. King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, 66 years later. So it's saying that Daniel served for 66 years. That's why I suggest he might have been around 80 when the lion's den happened, because that actually happened under the king of Persia, not the king of Babylon. If you look at the book of Ezra, and I don't ask you to turn there today, I'm just going to refer you to it. It says in Ezra 1:1, and this is the story of the captives returning, it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, again, 66 years after this story here, so that he might make a proclamation throughout his kingdom and put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, Ezra 1 verse 2, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. Is this what pagan kings do? Build temples in Jerusalem for the one true God? Well, Cyrus does. He's charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of God, the God of Israel, he who is God in Jerusalem. And then it goes on in verse 7. It says, Cyrus the king also brought the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. And it goes on to say he gives them back and says, you've got to put those back in the house of the God that you're going to build in Jerusalem. This is radical what happens. That one line at the end of Daniel 1, Daniel was there until King Cyrus, loaded statement. What it's saying is that while God's people seemed to be oppressed in Babylon and without hope, there was a whole ton of hope, because 66 years later, all of a sudden the king of the new empire was paying for the temple to be rebuilt and giving back the vessels of the house of God that were symbolic of God being taken away from Jerusalem and being put under their false gods. Do you see how things turned around? We tend to think things will never turn around. It's always going to get worse. And who knows, maybe they will keep getting worse. We know in the end things are going to be bad. But don't ever doubt that God can turn things around. If someone had told you 50 years ago Canada would be the way it is today, those of you who are a little bit older, you would have said, how could that happen? And yet here we are. I encourage you to imagine what God can still do in our country 50 years from now. Don't lose hope. Don't give up. Because God is faithful. God can still do a work in this nation. And He's going to work through people like you and me for whatever He has in store. Let me just pause and pray for you. And I believe as the worship team going to come and sing a closing song, I'll invite them to come as well. Lord Jesus, thank you for this book of Daniel. Thank you for this story that so closely relates to what we face today living in Canada. I pray that you would help each person here with whatever issues they're facing that challenge them perhaps to compromise or not stand firm for you. I pray, first of all, each one would resolve and purpose in their hearts to stand firm. I pray, secondly, Lord, that you would give us all much wisdom. It's so easy just to fight and gripe and complain. Help us, O Lord, to look for wins, look for ways we can work with people, develop relationships with people in authority in ways that we can help and make our nation better while still honoring your beliefs. Help us to be people of faith, knowing that you can still do a great work in our nation, and trusting that you'll work through each of us to do it. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, you know what? We are a community that loves Jesus, and we want you to be part of this. Feel free to give us a call or even drop us an email. We'd love to hear from you.